Warbirds in Review this is our 20th year, and we have progressed every year, and I think this is the best one ever. I hope you think so. And to see all of you out there for the programs as we put them on 2 a day. We could not do this without the sponsorship and the support of Scott's Miracle-Gro Company, my friend Jim Hagedorn, who owns the Old Crow Mustang out here and enjoys Oshkosh, enjoys the people, but he supports our veterans just unbelievable. Oh, I'm sorry, the Old Crow moved over here, didn't it? So in addition to Jim Hagedorn, Ron and Diane Fagan came to us a few years ago and said, we'd like to do something for you. We want to build you a production facility. So the beautiful building you see behind me is from Ron and Diane Fagan, Fagan Fighters World War II Museum in Granite Falls, Minnesota. And today's program could not be possible, and none of the programs could be possible without our large staff of volunteers and the talents of Sleeping Dog Productions, so a special thanks to them. And once again, our moderator today will be Sam Bass, who has been here, I think, all 20 years and done a great job for us. So he'll be out here very shortly to pay tribute, I guess is the best way to say that, to the Wasp and to let you know a little bit about their history. For me, as a female aviator, first I'm an aviator, I happen to be a female. Airplanes don't really know the difference, but I will tell you that the Wasp, who came along and did their part in World War II, are a big part of all of us who fly airplanes and had them as role models, so they are always very special to me, and to honor them is what we want to do and what we should do. Beyond their flying skills that they proved during World War II, the ladies were a class act. Their personalities, their quiet, I'm just here to do a job, is where I think most of us would want to be now who are female aviators. And with one more closing person here that I know shares my sentiments about the Wasp and how much we respect them and appreciate what they did before us, a lady that distinguished herself when the engine on her 737 came apart, and she has been a terrific role model to work with a lot of kids and introduce people to aviation now. Did an exemplary job, whether if she's a female or a guy. She did a great job. Tammy Jo Schultz is standing over here to say hello to the Wasp. Thanks for being here, Tammy. Always good to see you. And ladies and gentlemen, now if you will direct your attention to the video monitors, we have a nice video of the Wasp and a little bit about their history, and then Sam will come out with our guest. Thank you.
Japan's devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, launched the United States into full-blown total war with Japan, Germany, and Italy. Our civilian economy was transformed from civilian to wartime production, it seemed, overnight. Tens of thousands of young men enlisted or were drafted into uniform to fight the war. This left millions of jobs unfilled, and women came to factories all across industry to make guns, planes, ships, trucks, ammunition, and every other conceivable product to win the war. Nearly 19 million women were in America's wartime workforce, 3 million of them for their first time away from home responsibilities. Norman Rockwell's Saturday Evening Post cover featuring Rosie the Riveter was plastered all over the country, honoring women in America's fight.
On the street, in the home, in a crowd or alone, shout wherever you may be. I am an American. I'm proud of my liberty.
And we needed pilots for combat, tens of thousands of them. All of those would be young men, so female pilots jumped in to fill that void. In September 1942, two women's pilot organizations formed separately, the WFTD, Women's Flying Training Detachment, and the WAFS, Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. Well, in August 1943, those two were merged to create the WASP organization, Women's Airforce Service Pilots. General Hap Arnold, Chief of the Air Corps, selected the great female aviator Jackie Cochran to head up the WASPs. 25,000 women applied, 1,074 were accepted. All of them had prior flying experience and pilot's licenses. WASPs flew over 60 million air miles in every type of military aircraft. Our country is in their debt, and today we honor these great patriot aviators.
Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to 2020-21 / Warbirds in Review. Can I have our three guests here come on out? 4, actually, 5. I'm counting. They just keep showing up. Have a seat there, Lisa. We have Lisa here. Go over, y'all over there. Over here. Over here. There you go. The two airplanes here represent what they trained in at Avenger Field. This airplane is owned by the association here, and Lisa's going to tell us about it in just a few minutes. They fly the airplane. The pilot here is over here. We'll talk about the airplane a little later. And you're going to talk about this airplane also, right?
I've got a little time, I guess.
Okay. If you could make up something, it doesn't make any difference. We're really fortunate in here that John Marsh, his mother flew as one of the Wasp, and he's going to tell us the story about his mother's life and how she was recruited and all the way through the end of the Wasp, and maybe get into this. And what I'd like for you to do, Lisa, is you are the president of the museum, correct? Give us the history. Of course, we had part of it. David told us a little bit, but you give us the history from your standpoint about the Wasp, okay?
All right. So I am Lisa Taylor, and I'm the director of the National Wasp World War II Museum. We're located in Sweetwater on Avenger Field, where the Wasp learned to fly the military way. So our mission is not only to preserve their legacy, but to preserve the legacy of that field as well. So it's really our honor to do that. We're so happy to be here today. So I am going to give you some history on the museum, and John will be talking about his mother. We have Olga Custodio with us today. She's going to be speaking as a legacy pilot. And then Malcolm Lang, who flew in our UC-78 today. So thank you so much. You know, one of the questions that I am most often asked in the museum is, what kind of women were flying in 1942? You know, who were they? Were they all rich? You know, who were they? And in truth, they came from all walks of life. Some were born into a lot, and some scraped together every penny they had to learn how to fly. But I wanted to start off by telling you about a wasp that you may really be familiar with, and that's Cornelia Fort. She was born into high society, and her father had big plans for her within that high society. She had lived in a large home. She had several siblings, and they were taken to private lessons and, everything she wanted. When she was 19, her father threw a big coming out party for her, and it was all settled. But something happened that changed the trajectory of her life. She went up in an airplane. And she was captivated by that experience. Her father also died that year, and she decided to go a different way, much to her mother's dismay. And she became, I believe, the first female instructor pilot in Tennessee. And she went on to become an instructor pilot in Hawaii. Not a bad deal. This was in 1941. She wrote a letter to her mother saying, "I have the best pay. I have the best airplanes I could ever hope to fly. I'm in a beautiful place. I'll never leave here unless a better opportunity comes along." And that opportunity would come along sooner than later. She was up in the air with a young student, a male student, on December 7th, 1941. And he was going along flying. It was his last lesson before he would solo. They were flying across the air, and all of a sudden she realizes they're going to collide with another airplane. She takes the controls, and she diverts that head-on collision. And she turns around to see who on earth was coming at her, and she sees the Japanese red symbol on the side of that plane. And she had just inadvertently witnessed of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor and the U.S. entry into World War II. She would go on to become a WAF, one of the most experienced pilots. Nancy Harkness Love, actually, to back up a little bit, Nancy Harkness Love and Jackie Cochran both had plans on how to get women involved in flying during the war. And so Nancy's plan was to start a ferrying division, and it took her some time, many letters, but that did come to fruition. And Cornelia, I believe, was the second or third woman that she recruited. Cornelia would go on to die very tragically. She was the first WASP to die in a sad accident very near our facilities in Sweetwater. And when she died, Nancy took it very hard, and she wrote a letter to her mother and said, I loved Cornelia, I liked Cornelia, and the only comfort I can find is that she died doing exactly what she wanted, defending her country. And I think that's where a lot of these ladies were. America was pulling together in significant ways from Victory Gardens. We were all doing our part. And there was this group of women who were discovering they could fly, and they were good at it, and that's the way they wanted to help. And so thanks to the leadership of Nancy Love and Jackie Cochran, it came to fruition. We were behind in that war effort. We didn't have enough pilots. William Tunner, who had been put over the ferrying division, was desperate, and he didn't have enough male pilots to take the planes where they needed to go. And that's when he discovered that Nancy Love was sitting there underneath his own nose and able to fly. And then later, Jackie Cochran, working with Hap Arnold, formed the Wasp. And that was she took the inexperienced pilots who had far less time and started to train them for bigger missions. Not bigger missions, more missions. So they ferried airplanes, and they helped tow gunnery targets, strafing, smoke laying, and those kinds of things. So, but before they did that, they had to learn how to fly the military way, and that was where they spent their time in Sweetwater. The program started in Houston. It was not suitable airspace. It was crowded. It was often, the weather was bad. So they moved them to Sweetwater, and it was perfect because it was already an airfield, a training base, and they transferred the men out. They brought the women in, and it became the first all-through military training base. So they would have started primary with the Stearman, and then they would have worked their way up to this advanced trainer, the UC-78 Bobcat, before leaving. They spent half their day in flight school, right, learning navigation, math, science. They spent the other half flying, which is really what they wanted to do, of course. and of course calisthenics. It took some muscle to fly these airplanes. And then from there on, when they would graduate 6 to 7 months later, depending on the weather. And from that point on, they were sent to bases all over the country. And their part was they relieved men to go fly in combat. And then from there they could fly any plane that the Army Air Corps threw at them. And they did. From the fastest pursuit planes to the heaviest bombers, they flew those. So, one of my favorite stories, if you've been around the Wasp very long, you will have heard the B-29 story, right? The B-29 was hastily put together by Boeing because we needed to win this war. And Colonel Paul Tibbets was put in charge of finding the men to fly that. And the men were hesitant to fly it because it had this nasty habit of the engine catching on fire. So the men were reluctant. And my understanding is Colonel Tibbets made a call to Boeing and said, something's wrong with your airplane. And they said, no, you just have to follow directions. So he went to an airfield, Elgin Airfield, and he found 2 Wasp, and Dee Dorman and Dora Doherty, and said, could I talk you into flying a B-29? And they said, oh, yeah. We'll do that. He trained him in 3 days, and then he took him around to various air bases. And then, of course, they'd come in and make a beautiful landing. The men would run out to the flight line to congratulate these pilots. And when the ladies came out and took their caps off and the long hair fell down, they went, oh. But there was no trouble. After about, my understanding is 3 to 4 of these little demonstrations, and then the men were back in there. So, that's the plane that dropped the bombs on Hiroshima, and so I'd like to think that the Wasp helped win the war.
Backing up just a little bit, Lisa,
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the political and also the military initially opposing this.
Yeah. They were hesitant. It was such an unknown. Every pilot had to pass a physical. They'd never had any physicals on women, the Army flight surgeons. There was just so much unknown. Could they really fly these planes? And Hap Arnold initially didn't think that they could. But desperation leads you to a new place, right? And so toward the end, after Jackie Cochran had been making her case, Eleanor Roosevelt actually had her own column at the time, and she wrote this article that said, it is time to send in a secret weapon, and that secret weapon is our women. And really, we think that's kind of what pushed it, over the finish line. And they said, okay, we'll try it. But what I'm so proud to say is when that last class came through, the program lasted from 1942 to 1944. They had tried to militarize it. They'd put it before Congress, and the bill didn't pass. And so they were going to disband the program. But at that point, that last class graduated and never got to fly. But Hap Arnold came, and he spoke at their graduation, and he said, this is no longer an experiment. You've proved it. You have flown wingtip to wingtip with your brothers, and you have proved that women can fly military airplanes.
Why did the military never recognize them, though, as part of the military?
That's a question we ask ourselves a lot. In his address.
Was it all politics, I guess?
And that's what I would assume. In his address to the ladies, he said, we have it in the transcripts, he said, you will after he said, you've flown wingtip to wingtip with your brothers, you will never be forgotten. But those records were sealed. And I've never found a definitive answer as to why they were sealed. But, in 1972, when women were being accepted into the Army, the Wasp said, wait a minute, they're not first, we were first. And they had to bring their papers to prove it. They had kept their discharge papers and their, all the correspondence, and that was instrumental because Barry Goldwater saw one of their discharge papers, and he said, this is the same letter I got when I left. And it put it over the edge.
Now, only recently they've been recognized and they can be buried in Arlington. That who initiated that, the recognition?
So, they were finally, retroactively recognized in 1977 by Jimmy Carter, right? And yet, oddly enough, they weren't allowed to be buried in Arlington Cemetery, which to me is so odd. I mean, you're either in or you're not, right? So why that distinction? And so it was Elaine Harmon's greatest wish. She was a WASP. It was her greatest wish to be buried in Arlington Cemetery. And so after she passed away, her family began that fight. And I don't honestly remember how long it took, but it was a process. Yeah, a couple of years, maybe more. But big letter writing campaign. Took a while.
Now, you wanted Olga to make a comment here, did you?
Yes, I did. So we have Olga Custodio, and you've got the mic right there.
Yeah, she's got it.
Yes, so she's going to kind of speak to what happened after the WASP.
Yes, I'm retired Lieutenant Colonel Olga Custodio, and such an honor to be here. But what I want to tie in as a legacy is that we military female pilots that came in the late 70s and early 80s stand on the shoulders of these women who proved to the government that women could truly fly. We were capable of anything they threw our way. As one of the first female Air Force military pilots, it was a challenge at times to let them see what we were made of. But just to tag on a story that Lisa threw out when the women landed and they took off their garb and let their hair down, what I would do when I landed, I would take my gloves off so the crew chief coming up the ladder of the T-38 could see that I had fingernails, they looked great, and he knew I was a female, and he would not call me sir. So that was great. And in 1982, the WASP joined and contacted one of our pioneer female pilots, a T-38 instructor in Phoenix. I can't think of the name right now, but anyway, they had already formed an organization knowing that the new military female pilots were going to need the support and camaraderie to get us through this phase as we were new to the new era in the military. And it was called the Women Military Pilots Association. So we gathered together, and Bee Haydu and Sarah Hayden got us together, and as charter members of the Women Military Pilots Association, they kind of guided us and gave us that support and information that we were going to need to move forward as military pilots. So in 1983, we had our first convention with the WASP and the female pilots that we had. And one great story that I have and great experience is it took females from 3 different bases to form a T-38 four-ship formation. And we honored the military pilots, female military pilots and the WASP by flying over the Indianapolis Speedway during that convention. So it was the first time we had a four-ship formation of all-female T-38 pilots in 1983. Right now we have 800 members and still growing, and it's called the Women Military Aviators. So we include any female who is in the military involved with aviation, crew chiefs, flight engineers, and load masters, all of which belong to our organization.
Thank you, Olga. John, put you on the spot here now. Tell us about your mom, how she was recruited.
Can you hear me?
Yes, oh yeah, we can hear you just fine.
Okay, well first I want to thank you for allowing me to come in and speak about the WASP, and it's certainly a privilege. But I want to tell you a quick story about the WASP before I start talking about my mother. When the WASP were in Sweetwater for training, a male instructor walked in and looked around and said, you know what, I don't want to teach a bunch of damn women to fly. And the one WASP said to the other trainee, I'll get even with that guy if it's the last thing I ever do. Well, she did. She married him. True story. But as far as the training goes, my mother learned to fly with the civilian pilot training program in World War II. The government realized there was a shortage of pilots, and they started this training program, and it mandated 1 out of 10 people would be females. So it gave the ladies an opportunity to learn. So she had her pilot's license when the WASP program started, and she went to Sweetwater, got an invitation, and had to find her own way, like all the ladies. You get down to Sweetwater, you be here at this time, and you start your training. But as Lisa said, it was intensive but long days. But they were excellent pilots. You know, my mother started my interest in flying. I've been a pilot for 50 years. I have another brother that's a pilot. I've got a niece and a nephew that are pilots, and my niece is really carrying this forward. And so it's encouraging to me to see what the WASP started. The other thing, we've taken these WASP, I became good friends with a WASP named Shootsy Reynolds after my mother passed. She lived near me. And I took Shootsy to several reunions, and going through the airports with Shootsy, many of the lady pilots would come up and shake their hand and say, "Thank you, you opened these doors for us." I actually saw a TSA agent in the Dallas airport, and she said, "I really wanted to meet you," and there was tears coming down her face. And I thought, sometimes you don't realize the impact that these ladies had. This was my mother, and they were humble. Well, we just did what we had to, no big deal. But I know when I got my license, the first person I wanted to take up in the plane as a passenger was my mother. So she continued to fly. Our family had a Cessna 172, and some of the WASP continued flying after the WASP were disbanded. So it's been a great legacy, and I'm proud to be a part of the WASP Museum and see where this goes. But yeah, thank you again for.
Tell us about your ring.
This ring that I wear is to honor my friend Shootsy Reynolds that was a WASP. She was a jewelry maker. She was very talented.
That's the B-25. Sounds beautiful, doesn't it?
Oh, I love it. So Shootsy made the jewelry inside her shop that was located behind her house, and many of the WASP family would like to get these rings, and so she was making them. There's another fella now that sells these rings in Ohio, and just carrying on the WASP legacy. Shootsy also made earrings and made wristbands with the WASP wings. This is actually a WASP wing. If you look real close, it's the ring. That's the WASP wings. It's hard to say, WASP wing ring. But yeah, anyhow, there was a recruiting poster with Carolyn Jensen. She's a Thunderbird pilot for the Air Force, and if you look close, you'll see she's wearing a bracelet with the WASP wings that was made by Shootsy. So it just makes you proud to be part of this and to see what they've done and where their legacy has led.
Well, Lisa, over the years, I guess they had reunions over the years, right? Now, of course, they're all pretty much all gone now. Do their children, do they have these reunions? Do they ever have any reunions?
So we have had reunions at the museum for the last 20 years. And to my understanding, I know that they are in contact with each other. I'm looking at John because I know he's part of that group. But we do our best to host the families every year at the museum and give them a chance to see each other and catch up, basically. But
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So it's still carrying on. So
it does, yes.
And I could answer that too. We're called cows, kids of WASP, and we do. In the past, we escorted our mothers to these reunions. Well, now they're not coming to the reunions, and hopefully we'll get a large group of these kids of WASP next year to come to the WASP homecoming.
That'll be great, yeah. And I'm sure your granddaughter will be there.
Oh, she will. She actually came to the WASP homecoming a month ago. This is my niece, too.
Oh, it's your niece, okay.
Her niece is Katie Marsh. Katie Marsh is now an airline pilot, and she came to the museum as a reenactor. She flew in an AT-6 with the Wasp uniform, and as she got out, the little kids were coming up and asking her for autographs. So it just makes you glad to see this being paid forward and the younger generation running with this.
Malcolm, we're talking about airplanes now. Tell me a little bit. Well, we'll start off with the Stearman because that's what they flew first, and then they went into the UC-78. Yeah.
Anyway, I have the honor of being one of the pilots for the Wasp Museum. And the Wasp would start in the Stearman. And the Stearman is not really forgiving of crosswinds with a beginning pilot. So they had two auxiliary fields that they would fly where they could take off and land into the wind. And they would be trucked out there, and then they would wait their turn to go fly the Stearmans. Okay, the Stearman has a 220 Continental engine, and is not particularly fond of either crosswinds or taking off on hot days. And so they would wait out there with two porta potties and wait their turn to start flying in the Stearmans. When they were done and moved out of the Stearmans, they would move into BT-13s. The museum does have a flying BT-13. And they would move over to Avenger Field permanently, flying off of the pavement, move into a T-6, and then move into the UC-78s. This is where they did all of their multi-engine training. They had about 40 of them on the field at the time.
So was the Stearman, was that the first airplane they flew?
Early they started in PT-19 Fairchilds, but then they moved almost exclusively to Stearmans, yes.
The Stearman, which is a big airplane for somebody with little time.
I've flown with a 5'2" young lady in the front seat, and we had to have two pads to get her to see over the windscreen.
Well, talk about a little bit about the visibility when you're landing and that sort of stuff.
Well, you really can't see anything over the nose, depending on where you're sitting. The visibility on the front is restricted, from the back seat even more so. You use your peripheral vision completely. Once you've lined yourself up on the runway, you've had your nose down. Then as you flare, it's all peripheral vision trying to keep the airplane straight.
Now, how about the quirks on the airplane? Any quirks?
The Stearman's a very good airplane as a trainer, as long as you're not trying to use crosswinds. It is very unforgiving in any sort of gusty crosswind, and that's West Texas tends to be windy and have crosswinds, which is hence why they used a square mile for their initial training.
Right. Okay, how about the UC-78 here? First of all, why do they call it the bamboo bomber?
It has a wooden one-piece wing, so the wooden spar goes entirely through the wing, all the way to the wingtips. You remove the fuselage, it's all one piece, made up of spruce. It's no bamboo in it, and the structure is wooden ribs, wooden trailing spar, wooden leading spar. The only metal parts on the wing itself are the nacelles, engines, and the attachments.
Now, how different is this from the civilian version that Cessna had before this?
The T-50 and the AT-17 or UC-78 are all almost identical.
All the same?
Yes, sir. They all had the Jacobs 755-9 engines, 245 horsepower a side, with non-feathering propellers.
Now, how much time did they get in this and also in U-78?
Typically, it was 60 hours in the Stearman, 60 to 80 into the BT-13s, same in the T-6s, and the same into the UC-78 over a 9-week period.
So how long did it take the program from the start till they got their Wasp rings?
It took 6 to 7 months, depending on the weather.
That's pretty quick.
Yeah, to make sure they got their flying hours. Yeah, it really
that's
was.
To get that much time in 6 months, that's pretty tough. Yeah.
Yeah, they were flying constantly, sun up to sundown.
They went through the same training that the men did, other than combat.
Right. Okay. Now, total, how many were trained from the start to the end? Do you know?
Go ahead. 25,000 women applied, 1,830 were accepted, and 1,074 graduated. And 38 of the WASP actually lost their life.
That was my next question.
Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah. And actually, if you add the original WAFs that became part of the WASP program, that would be 1,108 when you add
Okay.
back those originals. But yeah.
Is it kind of like a twin beach as far as landing?
No.
Is it easier?
Yes, it is. I've flown Twin Beach, and this airplane, a Twin Beach, you typically want a wheel land
Right.
it because of the twin tails get
Right.
caught up in the prop bar. This one 3 points wonderfully. Do it routinely. And I got in trouble the other day. I was practicing 3-point full flap landings, and on my airfield where I was practicing is the Fat Tire Cowboys who do short field landings and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And they came over and asked me if I'd compete against the Super Cub because I was landing it and stopping it at 600 feet, making some of those guys look bad.
Well, that sounds like you're bragging on yourself.
No, I'm not. I was just trying to see how short I could land it. And they were trying to teach some of these guys how to do short field landings. And they're going, look, that stupid twin over there is doing a better job.
Yeah, okay. We got time here for a few questions. If we get somebody out here with the mics, got questions? Matt? This is my son and my grandson over here.
We've got two. That one, and I'll get this one. Excuse me? There you go, sir.
On the UC-78, what's the single engine performance or issues?
Horrible. The props do not feather. Okay? Single engine speed is 90 miles an hour, and it will not maintain altitude above a density altitude of 5,100 feet on a single engine if you're at or near gross. So I think this is the airplane that they said the other engine takes you to the point of impact.
Yes, sir. Who was next? Sir, excuse me.
Yeah, once the pilots graduated from primary flight training, how was it decided what they did for advanced flight training, where they went, and did they typically stay with that airplane for those 2 years?
Okay, so if I understand, of course, you're asking how it was decided where they would go, and then are you asking if they had a primary airplane?
No, how did they determine what airplane they were flying, where they went?
Right.
Okay.
Right. So I don't know how it was determined which Air Force or which base they would be based out of. They did not have a primary plane. They flew everything that was thrown at them, basically, because, one day they could be, in a trainer, the next day they could be in a bomber. It's just whatever needed to be ferried, or they did test flights as well. And so they had to just be well versed to handle anything that was thrown at them. So they would often read the manual and take off.
John, where
No
was your
training?
mom?
My mother was in Asheville in the Carolinas, and she flew the UC-78, the Bamboo bomber. She did a lot of transportation of personnel to the Pentagon and back. So that was where she was stationed. But to try to answer your question, I don't think the Wasp got to pick at all. They were assigned, you will go here and you will go here.
How about as far as training, though, getting type rated or training or type rated on the?
Can you hear me?
Like on a B-17 versus P-51 or whatever.
Well, I didn't get the beginning of your question. We had a good friend that was a Wasp, and she flew P-51s, and she had to put on weight to get in the Wasp. The minimum weight was 100 pounds. I don't think she ever weighed 100 pounds. To see this little wisp of a woman flying this P-51, and I think she said she had to sit on 2 parachutes just to see over the cockpit, and it just. So I don't know how they picked. You'd think you'd want somebody maybe that could reach the controls. They talked about having to reach, and how do you do this?
Matt, go ahead.
You said that the women flew all of the aircraft and up to the B-29 when it was struggling early on. Did they ferry the aircraft outside the continental U.S. or was it all inside the continental U.S.?
It was all inside. They never went overseas. They had to stay here.
Yes, ma'am.
You said you had 25,000 applicants?
Yes.
And so in 1,700 approximately made it. What happened to all the other ones?
They flunked.
What did you do with all the other ladies?
They were just rejected. And my understanding is not all the 25,000 were qualified. They had to have certain requirements. certain times in the cockpit, height, weight requirements. It was pretty strict. So that knocked out a lot of them. And then they had to have a personal interview either with Jacqueline Cochran or her assistant. And so that was the process that they chose by.
Did they have any problem other than, you mentioned that one of the pilots that said, I didn't want to check out any women. Later on, did they have any problem interfacing with the male instructors?
Well, some of the airports just didn't want women. Where are we going to put this women? It's all male base, and we've got to find a place for her. And I'll tell you another story. One of the women came to a base, and I think her name was Tony Smith. And she says, Tony Smith reporting for duty, and the commander says, oh, no, and Jesus Christ. She says, no, Tony Smith.
Yes, ma'am.
There's a lady that I knew that was a WASP, and I got to know her a bit. I really wish I could have recorded some of her stories. One of the stories she told me about, that she was ferrying an airplane. It was a two-place, and she was by herself, and it was either sabotaged or something else happened, and she had to climb over to the other seat to actually land it. And I like I say, I don't remember all of it, but she also was a pilot that would tow banners for the guys to shoot at. So could you tell the people a little bit about that?
Is she asking them whether they towed banners?
Right, about sabotage and towing targets. So towing gunnery targets was something that they were definitely assigned to. The ladies that did that had to do at least one mission a day, but they could do more. One WASP I'm fond of, Betty Strophus, that was her job. And she loved being up in the air so much that she would just beg for one mission after the other. And she said after she'd done that 2 days straight, she couldn't get out of bed. And they took her to the doctor and said, you're just exhausted. But so they did. They towed those gunnery targets. There's a cord off the back of the plane, and they were supposed to be shooting there. I have not read a lot of accounts of sabotage. I know that sometimes the planes did get hit. I mean, I talked to a son of a WASP, and he said, that was my mother's job. Her plane was hit 6 times, whether it was on purpose or not. You'd like to think not. I have heard of examples of sugar in the tank. I don't know if you have.
I have heard of sabotage, and if there was any, I know Jackie Cochran wanted to keep that quiet, wanted to keep this program a success rather than have it go down in flames.
I've got an example of sabotage. We were restoring a PT-19, and we'd got 2 new old stock fuel tanks. And we installed them, inspected them, everything looked good, and had bubbled some air up through the tank just to make sure everything was clear. And so when we got the airplane on we're going to test run it at idle, everything's fine, took off. First fuel tank, everything's good. Second fuel tank, engine died. Went back to the first fuel tank, came around, landed. And when we took it apart, someone had put a bolt into the fuel sump so that when air went through it this way, everything was fine. But at high flow, it blocked it. And it was done. This was new old stock, never been opened up. It was in Cosmoline. It was brand new. So yes, there was examples of sabotage.
Someone over here? Right here. Yes, ma'am.
So this is a two-parter. Number one, how can we support the museum in Sweetwater? And number two, you mentioned something about a reunion. What are the plans for the reunion in 2022?
Thanks for that question. So I think I touched on this earlier. We have a fly-in every year. Really, we've called it homecoming since its inception because the WASP were coming home to Avenger Field. In fact, 13 WASP, their families have spread their mother's ashes on our taxiways. And so it's been a pretty solemn occasion at times, but it's always been a great time for them to get together and such. Anyway, we do have WASP left. They no longer travel. And so we seek to still honor them by having their aircraft on the field, by having legacy pilots such as Olga, and by having their families like John. And because their legacy, what they did not die in 1944, right? It has lasting implications till today. So in May, we had a fly-in. We had 11 BT-13s on the field, which was record-setting. One of our other pilots, Brian Lang, who was here a minute ago, arranged for all those BTs to be on the field. We had a great time with everyone. Our next one is going to be April 30th. We're going to have a loose affiliation of chick fighter pilots. So we're excited to have them there. And then as well as families. We'll have lots of activities, airplanes, and we're going to celebrate women in aviation. How's that?
One more question? Nobody.
Right up here.
Oh, okay. Yes, sir. They're bringing you a mic. There you go.
Is there any way that I could leave information toward the children of the Wasps to contact me? My check pilot for my check pilot for both my private and commercial was a Wasp.
Aww.
And I would love to get a hold of her children. I know she's long since passed away. Is there any database or any way of contacting these children?
I'm on a list for Kids of the Wasp. I'd be happy to share the information with that list. You see me after the show.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you.
Well, thank you folks for coming today, and it's a real honor to have you people here. And thank you. Appreciate that, your little talk there,
Yes,
Olga.
we're so appreciative to have Olga and Malcolm
Thank
here.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, folks.